Okay. So we talked a lot about the brain last time, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and then we're going to talk about organization of hierarchical systems, and then we're going to talk about their representation in mythology. So this is from a paper by Swanson, and Swanson has been studying the hypothalamus for a very long time and brain organization in general. And the way he conceptualizes it is in a rather Piagetian sense, and so the essential outputs of the nervous system are basically patterns of motor behavior, and those are controlled by patterns of spinal cord activity, and those are controlled by patterns at higher brain levels, including the hypothalamus, and then those are controlled by emotional systems. There's patterned responses at the emotional level, and then those are controlled by patterned responses at the level of the cortex. And the body sort of builds itself from the bottom up. And as it builds itself from the bottom up, it's trying to integrate the function of all the systems that are necessary for the maintenance of the biological maintenance of life in the medium term, short term, medium term, and long term, and in a social context that works for the social context and also works for the individual context. So you can imagine that that's a rather, it's hypothetically possible that there's only a certain set of solutions to a problem that complex. And if that's the case, then that would account for the emergence of something approximating a universal morality, and it would also explain why every possible political system won't work. So now this is Swanson's map of the hypothalamus. Now you'll note that the hypothalamic structures, they're the ones with the little circles and so on the left. It, like every other element of the brain, the hypothalamus isn't a homogeneous structure, right? And generally when you name something, if you think about it, the name presumes a homogeneous structure, because otherwise you would differentiate the name and you would call it a bunch of names instead of just one. And so what happens, for example, that as people learn more about the brain, you'll notice this as you learn more about the brain, you stop thinking about it necessarily as the brain, which is like a homogeneous mass of neurons, and you start thinking about it in terms of its functional subsystems. And then once you learn more about those, you think about those functional subsystems in terms of their functional subsystems, and you can keep differentiating all the way down. You can differentiate all the way down to the molecular level. And so as your knowledge improves, your level of resolution improves, and you can use more and more precise terminology. What you see is that the hypothalamus is composed of a number of systems. And one of the things that Swanson has done with this particular diagram is indicate which parts of the hypothalamus, this is in a rat's brain, are basically responsible for reproductive behaviors and which are responsible for defensive behaviors. And that's part of the hypothalamus. Now, the other part, so there's a very archaic system way down in the bottom of the brain, older than emotions, about as old as pain, that's responsible for these very fundamental motivational drives. So you can think about the hypothalamus, if you want to think about it this way, as the part of the biological basis of what Freud would have called the id. Now, we don't have to think about it as in terms of relatively vague statements like the id anymore, because we know more about the underlying circuitry, and we know that it's quite standard across mammalian species and even farther back in the phylogenetic chain than just mammals. So, yeah?
What do you mean older than emotion? Do you mean that the affective valence for that system would be assessed just by pain or absence of pain?
Yeah, well, you know, systems develop in an evolutionary chain, right? And some systems are more primordial than others. And so the hypothalamic systems are more primordial than the hippocampal and the amygdalic systems. And so pain, you can think of pain as an emotion. People usually don't. They usually think about it as a motivational system. But the distinction between those terms is vague anyways. Pain has an emotion-like component and a motivation-like component, like anger does. All I mean by older is that it was there first. So anxiety, for example, seems to be an elaboration of pain. So pain represents, pain indicates damage to the system that's being stimulated, basically, something like that.
Pleasure wouldn't constitute an emotion, right?
Well, let me get to that, because I will get to that, because that's another,
I mean, reproduction for some mammals has a pleasurable component.
probably for all of them.
Yeah, for mammals.
Yeah. So this governs reproductive behavior. There would be outputs from the reproductive system to other systems that mediate positive emotion. But they're old too. So part of the hypothalamus is devoted to these motivation-like processes. I think they're motivation-like personalities. And part of it is actually devoted, the other part of it, the other half of it is devoted towards exploration. And the exploration system is the source, the roots of the exploration system in the hypothalamus are the bottom part of the structure that produces the kind of positive emotion that's associated with approach and joy. So, and it's also extremely old because it has its roots in the hypothalamus, so that's the dopaminergic system. So half the hypothalamus, roughly speaking, is devoted towards the regulation of fundamentally motivated behaviors, like sexuality and defensive aggression, say, and the other half of it is devoted towards exploration. And so that's quite interesting, because one of the things it means is that exploration, the tendency, the proclivity towards exploration is also unbelievably archaic. It's really, really old. And as I mentioned, I think I told you this before, if you study the behavior of a decorticate cat, which is a cat that really has almost no brain left except the hypothalamus and the spinal structures, that cat is hyper-exploratory, sorry. It explores more than a normal cat, which is quite strange given that it doesn't have much of a brain. But part of the reason it explores more is because it can't form the memory structures that would inhibit the exploration as a consequence of learning. So basically what happens is you're curious about something until you figure it out, and then you've built a representation of it, which is in some sense a representation of what to do around that thing. And once you've built that representation, it's not necessary to be curious about that thing anymore because you've figured it out, and you might as well go on to some other thing that you don't understand. But if you don't have much of a brain, you can't store the consequences of your exploratory activity, and so you can't inhibit it. So that's why a cat without a brain is hyper-exploratory. So what I think is really interesting about the hypothalamic work is that we're going to talk a lot about the representation of exploration in mythology. And it was very interesting to me to learn that the proclivity towards exploration and the positive emotion that's associated with that is so ancient that it's grounded in the hypothalamus. So it's as old, so to speak, as hunger and sex. And those are very, very old things. So now, you might say, well, if the hypothalamus can do all this, why do you need the rest of the brain? And that's a perfectly good question. Some animals don't have much more brain than that. It seems to me that the reason that you need it is because when you have motivational system A and motivational system B and motivational system C and motivational system D, there are conflicts, there are potential conflicts between their operations across spans of time. One can interfere with another. And the optimal arrangement is so that the operations of each of these systems is sequenced in such a manner that each of them get what they need on an ongoing basis. And so part of the reason that you need the rest of your brain is to do the proper sequencing, is to figure out when you should do what. And so the rest of the brain in part is there to take time into account. But it's not only there to take time into account, it's also there to take context into account. Because reproductive behavior, for example, has to be context sensitive. Even though it's a fundamental motivation, it has to be context sensitive because every situation is not the same as every other situation, especially among animals that become increasingly complex. So part of the reason that you need more brain, or that it might be worthwhile under some conditions to have more brain, is to solve the problem of how to organize multiple fundamental motivational systems working simultaneously. And that's a lot of the problems that you're trying to solve on a day-to-day basis are precisely that. You know, you have to add emotional regulation to that, and you have to also, because we're social animals, you have to add the problem of the fact that there's all sorts of other people who are trying to do exactly the same thing, cooperatively and competitively in the same environment, across different spans of time. So it's a very complex optimization problem. It doesn't seem like it's precisely computable. A lot of it seems to have to, a lot of the way we do it seems to have to do with ongoing negotiation. You know, because you might say, well, what's the answer to the proper hierarchical arrangement of motivational necessities? And I think that the past can offer hints in that direction, and also can probably inform us about what won't work. But those are sort of vague and broad, and in order to determine how to update that and bring it into the present, there has to be continual ongoing communication and negotiation. So, okay, so then you can think about the relationship between what we were thinking about as the fundamental unit of personality, because I think of this not only as the fundamental unit of narrative, but the fundamental unit of personality, is that the basic motivational systems, which I've sort of outlined here in schematic format. I'm not claiming that these are precisely accurate or scientific categories, but you can think of them, the basic motivational states, basically as associated with self-propagation and self-maintenance. Those are the two big problems that a living creature has to solve, and then those problems are broken down into the operation of more specialized subsystems, like the desire for affiliation, which seems to be a basic motivation among people, sexual desire. Those are all self-propagation motivations, thermoregulation, thirst, hunger, elimination, all the sorts of things that you think of as basic biological necessities. And so each of those has the capacity to pop up something that's approximating a personality when it needs to. And so it's not a drive, which is an important thing to realize. There's a drive-like element to the degree that that process has become habitual, or that it's based in instinct. So the more drive-like something is, the more likely it is that lower levels in the nervous system are taking care of it. And so maybe spinal systems, for example. So, you know, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll jerk it back fast before you feel the pain. And that's because there's a reflex loop between the sensory receptors on your hand and your spinal cord. It's very fast. It just goes like that. It's a sensory motor loop. And it's basically deterministic. So things at extremely high resolution become increasingly deterministic. So the pain comes in after you've pulled your hand away, and that seems to be something like it's teaching you, in some sense, your body is teaching you, that's one way of thinking about it, not to do that stupid thing again. And people also think maybe that pain immobilizes us so that we're more likely to heal or less likely to keep engaging in the behavior that caused the damage. So, all right, so our motivational systems are popping up these little personalities all the time. And, you know, one of the dictums of psychoanalytic thought is that those little motivational personalities can more or less have a life of their own, because they're subsets of you. And if they're not integrated into the complete personality well, then when they emerge, they're going to be rather primordial and unsophisticated. And you see this in people, for example, who have outbursts of anger. You know, it's that it isn't exactly reasonable to say that they've become disinhibited, although that's one way of thinking about it. It's actually more reasonable to assume that they haven't developed enough sophistication to integrate that motivational system, so that capacity for anger, for example, into their personality as a whole. And one of the dictums of Jungian psychotherapy in particular is that it's extraordinarily useful to integrate those elements of your personality that might have like a fiery-like nature, a potentially dangerous nature. Anger and aggression is a really good example of that, but sexual desire is also a really good example of that. If you're sophisticated, you have that system at hand when you need it, but you don't use it in a manner that's destructive to your operations as a whole across time, and you don't use it in a manner that disrupts the relationship that you've established socially with your family and broader society. So it's all integrated. It's like it's integrated into a game. And one of the things you might think about is that a lot of the games that people do play and that people like to watch are games of aggression integration. You know, so football is a really good example of that. I mean, those guys are massive and they're strong and they're aggressive. But, you know, by and large, when they're in the football game, they use that to further the game. Now, they're trying to win individually and their team's trying to win, but at the same time, both teams are competing within a framework of rules, and that's in a broader framework that encompasses the entire audience, which is also continually giving them feedback on the quality of their play. You know, so if somebody does something particularly brutal and unnecessary, the whole audience is going to complain about that. You know, and that's one of the ways by which the players determine how much force can be used and how much force can't be used. Because as the game continues, it's not easy to tell when you're being too aggressive or not too aggressive. You know, so it's funny, I was reading a little while ago about the Canada-Russia hockey series in 1972, and if I remember correctly, the Canadians played by European rules, which meant that there was no body checking. So that was kind of hard on them, because the Europeans don't check, but the Canadians claimed that in games they played where there was no checking, there was a lot more hitting with the ends of sticks and a lot more slashing, and like there were still all sorts of aggression, but it was never able to get up to the point where you could give someone a solid hit. And the Canadians' take on that was that the game wasn't necessarily less dangerous or less rough without checking. It's just that the aggression got subordinated. And so, you know, it's not an easy thing to figure out exactly what level of force is necessary to push any given thing forward. But none is definitely the wrong answer. You know, and if you're ever involved, which you will be, and no doubt are now, if you're involved in difficult negotiations as you move forward, salary negotiations or negotiations about a given project, or even complaints, that even attempts on your part to solve problems at work, like being subject to, you know, to arbitrary tyranny or being bored to death by a useless project or something like that, if you don't have that capacity for force at hand, you're not going to win. You're not going to win. You're just going to get walked over. And how much force you need, that's part of the ongoing dialogue. And so, and that's really worth thinking about. A lot of what happens in psychotherapy, as well as exposure to things that people are afraid of, and the development of new micro skills. So for example, if I have a client who isn't very socially skilled, you know, we might practice things like shaking hands and telling each other who we are. Because if you don't have that down as a routine, it's difficult to make a foray into a broader social environment. So sometimes people are stopped socially because they lack micro skills, and sometimes it's because they're afraid, and those two things interplay. But another thing that happens in therapy an awful lot is that people come in for assertiveness training. You know, and they're people who've they're usually agreeable in temperament, but they're also people who have failed to integrate that capacity for aggression into their personality for one reason or another. Maybe they weren't taught to. That's certainly possible. Maybe when they manifested aggression, they were punished for it. Maybe they observed other people who were too aggressive and decided that they were never going to be like that. That's a common response. But it doesn't really matter, because once you're an adult and you're working in a competitive world, which you will definitely be, you have to have that capacity, because otherwise you get pushed to the bottom of the dominance hierarchy and exploited. And so, and it's not necessarily because of malevolence. Partly it can be that, but often it's the consequence of the fact that generally if you're negotiating for something, there are forces pulling on that from all directions. And what outcome is obviously right is not obvious at all. And so it's a matter of negotiation. And so you have to be able to put your position forward with some force and not be timid about it and be articulate about it. And all that is a consequence of integrating these systems that can be very dangerous if they're not working properly into your personality, rather than ignoring them and letting them run in an underground fashion, which is what they would do. Yes?
What you're talking about kind of reminds me of Freudian sublimation. Is that so good?
Yeah, well, the thing about Freud, so the comment was that it's reminiscent of Freudian sublimation. Freud more or less had an inhibitory model of socialization, you know, because he thought of people as pushed by the id, so that the ego, as pushed by the id and inhibited by the superego. And there's some truth in that, to the degree that you're subject to quasi-tyrannical pressure by a society that isn't well integrated. A lot of what's going to happen to you is, don't do that. And the capacity to not do something that you're motivated to do, like an impulsive thing, is obviously necessary. But sublimation, in a sense, is the basis of Piagetian theory. And Piaget's alternative to Freudian thinking is that it's not inhibitory, especially not if your personality is properly integrated. What it is instead is integration into a game-like structure. We're going to talk more about that. So the point is that you're starting at high levels of resolution with your body, you know, and you're building these structures out of your capacity to move and your capacity to perceive and these motivational systems that are driving you. And as you become socialized and as you bring more and more people into the conversation, the hierarchy gets more and more complex and sophisticated. And then it's the whole thing that's regulating. It's not inhibitory. You know, so you don't want to inhibit your aggression. You want to harness it so it serves the purposes of the individual and the greater good, if you can figure out how to do that. It's better that way because you have more power. Now, it might be better for you to be cowardly and retreating if the alternative is to be impulsively aggressive and destructive. But that's not nearly as good as having the capacity for aggression at your hand and being able to use it in a sophisticated manner. So, all right, so this is a way of thinking about how things, yes? I don't think you can say that it's that simple. I mean, I think that happens, but how it happens we don't know. And the thing too is that this organization does not only take place in your brain. That's another thing that the psychoanalysts, I think, overestimated, because they tended to think of psychic regulation as internal, but it's not. So, for example, as long as you're acceptable to your peers, you seldom have to regulate your own behavior, because they'll regulate it for you, right? And so when you're out in the world, I mean, you guys are all sitting there in a particular way, partly because if you deviated from the appropriate way to sit there, whatever that is, if you deviated from that sufficiently, the group would turn on you right away. So as long as you're awake enough to respond to the subtle cues that people are giving you, you don't even have to worry about the internal inhibitory problem. Now what you want is you want your nervous system organized in a way so that it fits well into the overall organization of the society. And there has to be crosstalk between those. But society exists, right? So anything society will do to regulate you, you don't have to do. And that's really useful. It's an outsourcing problem. You know, and there's lots of things you outsource. So one of the things is, think about something like self-esteem. Now, self-esteem is I don't like the word, because self-esteem is really something like extroversion minus neuroticism. It's close to that. But let's look at it in a slightly different way. Let's say, well, how valuable should you regard yourself? And so then you think, well, and then we might think, well, maybe that has something to do with competence. Okay, well, so how competent are you? Well, the answer to that is you really don't know, and there's actually no way of telling. So your nervous system has to guess, and the way it does that is that first, you're put on a normal distribution for negative emotion, and that you're just sort of given that at birth, that's your temperament. And then the socialization can pull that one way or another. You know, it can make you more stable or less stable depending on how you interact with your parents and the immediate environment and how dangerous the environment is. And then the next thing you do is you observe yourself operating in the world and you see how good you are at solving problems, and that adjusts it. And then everyone else is broadcasting to you all the time what your comparative value is. And so that's really how you establish an estimate of your competence. And it's almost always comparative competence, because the question in most groups isn't can you do something? It is. But the real question is, can you do something as well or better than anyone else in this particular group? Because there's no absolute standard for being able to do things precisely, you know. Everyone is insufficient when you think of the ultimate task, right? Because people's knowledge have limits. So the question is, well, are you up for the challenge compared to the people around you? So it's a very complex calibration process, and it certainly doesn't all take place inside. It can't. You're not complex enough to do that, and it's foolish anyways. You know, partly what the stock market does, the stock market is a massive conversation about the relative value of property, roughly speaking. And it moves around a lot, because you think about all the variables that are being taken into account at the same time. It's not only every company and every commodity in relationship to every other company and every other commodity. It's also all that in relationship to the price of all the currencies. And that takes into account political stability or instability and disease and catastrophe and hurricanes and so on and so forth. And like that, there has to be something dynamic and ongoing that enables those calculations to be made, because it's incalculable otherwise. And the same thing is true in some sense of your competence. You can't calculate that on your own. You have to have help. And so that's partly why the group also decides where you are in the dominance hierarchy. Now the group can also under or overshoot. That happens lots of times, you know, because maybe the local environment that you're in isn't a very good representative of the broader environment. This happens to lots of smart people in high school, for example, or junior high, where if they're intelligent, that is not necessarily socially valuable for a number of years. And if the person who's intelligent doesn't get out of that environment into an environment where intelligence is valued, so hopefully that's a university, then you know, their actual potential isn't going to be valued by the dominance hierarchy in proper keeping with its actual real world value. So anyways, okay, so the issue is, and this is the ethical issue, is how do you hierarchically organize these subpersonalities? Because you might think, well, why do you have to hierarchically organize them to begin with? Now, there's an element here. For the postmodernists, you can think of this. So 130 years ago, Nietzsche announced that God was dead, right? And so that was a reflection of the collapse, in some sense, of the believability of traditional religions. And you can think of traditional religions as a coherent, overarching narrative. Now, you might argue about how coherent it is, but they're pretty coherent. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate, but they're pretty coherent. So the slats were pulled out from underneath those structures. Now, what happened during the 20th century was two things, and one was some of those religious narratives were replaced by ideological narratives, and that turned out to be a really bad idea. And so that was one stream of thought, in some sense stemming from Nietzsche, or at least from his observation. There was another stream of thought which basically said, if religious structures have collapsed, and they had to, that means all grand narratives have collapsed. And that's really a postmodernist claim. But the problem with that claim is, you can't act unless you have a hierarchy of values, because you can't figure out what to do next. Also, you can't even figure out if you should do anything. But you certainly can't figure out what to do next. Because in order to organize your behavior and move forward, you have to say that one thing is more important than many other things, right? Every time you act, you're making that decision. Now, you might say, well, you can only make that decision at a micro level, like what's best now, but people who do that are impulsive. That's how we define them, and that doesn't work out well across time. You know, what they're doing is responding to, in some sense, instinctual whims moment by moment. That doesn't seem very sophisticated. You don't want someone around like that. You can't predict what they're going to do. You can't cooperate with them. They can't follow rules. You can't have a project with them. You can't trust them. It's like, that isn't going to work. And so the idea that grand narratives are obsolete is it's based on a misunderstanding of exactly what the narratives are. And it's also based on absence of realization that a narrative is primarily something you act out before you represent. So a narrative can be latent. So let me give you an example of that. So I thought puzzled about this for a long time. Let's say you go out and watch a chimpanzee troop. Now we know that chimps are organized in a dominance hierarchy. And we know that the dominance hierarchy among chimps is male dominated. The females have a dominance hierarchy too, but the fundamental dominance hierarchy is male dominated. It's not like that so much with bonobos, by the way, which are very much like chimps. So you can watch the chimps, and you can see that chimp A knows that chimp B is higher up in the dominance hierarchy, and chimp D knows that chimp C is higher up in the dominance hierarchy. And you can even see that the offspring, like if you have a high dominant female and she has offspring, all the other chimps know that you don't mess around with her offspring because she's a dominant female. So the mapping of the dominance hierarchy, the mapping is quite sophisticated. So then you might say, well, the chimps are following rules. But then you think, well, no, they're not, because they don't actually know rules, because you got to ask what exactly is a rule, right? Well, that's a good question. Like, a rule seems to be the articulation of a principle, but it seems to be something that you have to represent. Like you say, well, a rule is chimp B always submits to chimp A. That's the rule that the chimp is following. But the chimp isn't following rules, because the chimp doesn't have rules. But there's regularities there, and so what those really are behavioral patterns. They're not rules. Now, understanding that is extremely useful, because what you can understand is that regularities in complex social behavior can emerge in the absence of any conscious representation, any consciously articulated representation of those rules. Because you might ask, well, where do moral presuppositions come from? Assuming that, say, religious systems, for example, are concerned with moral presuppositions, and that social systems are concerned with those too. Where do they come from? Well, there's lots of theories about that, right? The Marxists would say, well, it's all about exploitation and economic advantage. And the postmodernists would say it's all about exclusion and power, because they're sort of quasi-Marxists, sort of. They're quasi-Marxists anyways. There's always this, and you know, for Karl Marx, religion was the opiate of the people, and he thought about it as a structure that had emerged because the power elites wanted to dominate the people who weren't in power, and to extract out value from them. And it's like, there's no doubt that there can be an element of exploitation in any social system, and there's no doubt that social systems are hierarchical, so that there are people on the top and people on the bottom. But in human society, there's lots of dominance hierarchies. There's not just one. And we value lots of different things from people. And it's by no means obvious that the dominance hierarchies were set up consciously, through conscious thought, by any group of people over any span of time for any purpose whatsoever. It's particularly obvious when you also understand that, well, we are not the only things that have dominance hierarchies. Chimps have them, wolves have them. That's why you can have a pet dog. You understand a dog. You know, it doesn't even want to be the boss in the house. That's a nervous and upset dog. It wants to have its position as a valued, low-level entity in the dominance hierarchy, and a dog is just absolutely happy when that happens. So, you know, because what is a dog going to do? Buy groceries? It's like, no, it's not. So it has to be low in the dominance hierarchy, because it doesn't have the competence. And one of the things that's very, very bizarre about Marxist and postmodernist thinking is that there doesn't seem to be any recognition that dominance hierarchies are often structured based on competence, not on like arbitrary distribution of power. I mean, if you want to go have your appendix out, what are you going to look for? Are you going to look for the most powerful doctor? Or are you going to look for the most competent doctor? Well, you hope that there's a rough relationship between power and status and competence, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to figure it out? But if it's a good hierarchy, it's based on competence, not on arbitrary power. So we might say that when a dominance hierarchy starts to be based on arbitrary power, or purely on economic terms, then it's actually turned into a tyranny. It's no longer a functional hierarchy. It's already stultified and twisted into a form that can't be sustained. And then people are going to get upset about that and start talking about it, or worse, they're going to start doing things that are quite disruptive. But the idea that the hierarchical structure per se is pathological, or that it's consciously imposed, or that it's not necessary, or that it has nothing to do with competence, it's like, no, that's just, that better not be the case, because we would be in serious trouble if it was the case. So I would say the more functional the society, the more the power hierarchy is based on competence in relationship to what the society deems as actually valuable. Now, obviously no society meets those criteria perfectly, because you can't. It's part of a dialogue and a continual processing of information, you know, so you can't hit the target, it's always moving. But you can hope that the dialogue continues. So here's a little vision I had of how things work, like a democratic society works, okay? Because people often think if they're conservative, orderly, low in openness, then they think the conservatives are right, and if they're more on the liberal or on the left side, high in openness, low in orderliness, then they think that the left is correct. But the left and the right aren't correct. They represent different systems of values, and the values that they represent are valid sometimes in some situations. And then the question is, well, when and in what situations? And the answer to that is, not only do you not know, you can't tell. And so it's like this. So imagine that people are on a cliff. It's like they're on a flat plateau, and it's a cliff on both sides. And down at the bottom of the cliff is fire and rocks. And so you want to stay on top of that cliff, and it's quite narrow. And there's a line you should walk down, right down the middle, but you can't tell where it is. So what do? You put all the lefties here, and you put all the right-wingers here, and you put a rope between them, and you tie the rope to you. And the right pulls this way, and the left pulls that way, and if they're pulling properly, then you can walk right down the middle. But the only way they can pull properly is if they keep talking to one another. You know, and if the left disappears, then the right pulls everything over the cliff down into the flaming rocks. And if the left disappears, then the right pulls everything off the cliff down onto the rocks. And we know that. And there's been good personality models developed recently. They're not public yet, precisely, that show that if you push a virtue to its extreme, it turns into a vice. And that all the vices basically end up in the same place. Yes?
What would you say happens if both sides are talking a lot but not to one another? Like if there's a lot of preaching to the choir on either side.
Well, it's dysfunction.
Yeah.
It's dysfunction.
Because I was thinking about modern American politics where they can actually show with data that it's increasingly polarized, like just increasingly left and right subcultures.
Well, what that means is that people can't get along. That's what it means. And you know, you can say, well, part of getting along is following a shared set of rules, and that's true, but the rules are kind of low resolution. But to get along, like you think about your family. If your family is structured so that it's just a bunch of rules and you better damn follow them or there'll be punishment, you know, that can be better than just sheer chaos. But it's not as good as general principles encompassing continual dialogue. That works best. And you know, you might think, well, what are the general principles? And what we'd hope are, well, we can look at what people have done in the past, and we can look at our history and our culture, and we can think, okay, we're going to try not to do the stupid things that people have done in the past that are evidently stupid, like maybe Nazism isn't the way to go, for example. So we're going to try not to do that. We can extract out those general principles, but then we have to talk continually in the present because the present keeps moving around. There's no way of mapping it using a structure from the past. You can only approximate it. You know, it's like, you know, if you took a Google map of Toronto from 10 years ago and you said, well, this is the map, it's not going to be updated. It's like you'd have a real rough time driving around the waterfront because you'd keep running into skyscrapers that, you know, aren't supposed to be there. And so the map is obviously useful, but the update process is also unbelievably useful. And you can also say, if you look at left and right, you can roughly say that the left is on the side of update and the right is on the side of structure. And you might say, well, how much update and how much structure? It's like, enough to solve the problem. That's the answer. What's the problem? Keeps changing. How do we keep up? We talk. And part of that also is, like if you're talking, most of you guys are lefties because most of you are open and not very orderly. Now, there's going to be exceptions in here, and you're young, because youth is often associated with political beliefs that are more on the left. And I think that's because you're in a more plastic state of development, right? There's still a lot of things open to you. So, but the thing about it is that you have to get along with the right, and that's partly because the right represents what's already there. So how do you do that? Well, that's hard, but the one thing you definitely do is listen. You try to figure out what the hell they're up to, you know, and why, and what they stand for, and the value of that, and where it's too extreme. And it's not easy, but that's why democracy is a dialogue, and not, that's how it regulates itself, is through the dialogue. Okay, so what you're basically trying to do is integrate your abilities, your sub-personalities, which is how I'm going to represent it, into a functional hierarchy. And a functional hierarchy is one where the subsidiary parts of the hierarchy don't conflict. So let me give you an example. You can tell me what, and I based this on the Piagetian notion of the equilibrated state. So Piaget had this idea that there's two ways you might be able to run an organization. So say you're moving towards a collectively defined goal. And one would be to put someone at the top of it and kind of give them complete control, tyrannical power. And so that meant you were going to do what that person said or else. Okay. Now the problem with that is that that person isn't always going to be right, and that you're not always going to be happy about doing what they say, and that the fact that you're not happy means you're not going to be as productive, and it also means that the organization is going to have to expend quite a lot of energy keeping you in line. Okay, so here's an alternative. Alternative is, here's the goal. Let's agree on some general principles in relationship to the goal, and then let's negotiate. So one of the things I did with my kids when they were teenagers was, you know, that there's a certain set of procedures that have to be undertaken in a household in order for that household to function, right? So roughly speaking, people need to eat. It should be clean enough so that contamination isn't a problem. It shouldn't be so messy that it's impossible to do anything that you want to do in a house, you know, etc. There's guidelines that we all basically implicitly understand that constitute a well-regulated familial environment. Well, so then how do you obtain that? And one of the processes that I put into place was we would meet and parse up the jobs and come to a solution, and the rule was you can't leave the discussion until the solution is found. You have to accept the solution unless you can come up with a better one, and that we'll implement it over a period of time and see how it works. And that worked. I wouldn't say it worked perfectly, because nothing works perfectly. But it's a good process, because it brings everyone into the game. They get to define the end, they get to define the game, they get to define the rules, they get to define the processes by which those rules will be enforced. They get to run it as a simulation and see how it works, and then at some point later they get to have another discussion about it. But you don't want to be discussing it every time there's dishes to be done. You won't want to discuss the entire moral substructure of the whole household. You know, and dishes are a big deal because they're part of, dishes and cooking are a big deal because they're part of the, there's a tremendous conflict in that area because of the rapid role transformation that characterized men and women since the pill was invented. So it's a place where, you know, massive social transformations manifest themselves in local landscapes. And that's also why solving the problems in your local landscape is also the way of solving the big problems. You know, it's like, who does the dishes, when and why, and what are the rewards and punishments associated with that? Solve that, and you've solved like 30% of the tension between men and women. So, and that means it's really hard to solve. It's not obvious how you do that, and how you do that over the long run, and what the reward should be, and how valuable it is. So, et cetera, et cetera. It takes an awful lot of negotiation. But if you don't get it right, then you have a continual war in your household. And you pay for that, because if you're having a war in your household, then you're going to be stressed to death, and that will kill you. So it's no joke to get these things right. And when you're doing it, it's applied philosophy. It's sophisticated and applied philosophy, because that's all you have if you don't have roles. Right? Roles, you don't negotiate. And that's good, because you don't know how to negotiate. No roles, it's negotiation, slavery, or tyranny. Those are your options. So these are very complicated problems. That's also, though, why when you work hard to solve them in the domain that you have in your hands, you're also doing the best you can possibly do to figure out how that might scale up in a broader way, right? I read a great book once called Systemantics, written by a guy named John Galt. It's a really fantastic book. Yeah, I know, John Galt, eh? Weird enough, man. It was actually his name. John Galt is the name of a fictional character in an Ayn Rand book. And he's one person who stops the world because, for a variety of reasons. He stops the industrial world because he's thinking he's getting exploited. It's had a huge effect on modern American monetary policy, by the way. So, anyways, this guy John Galt has written a whole bunch of axioms about organizational structure, which are quite brilliant. And there's a couple I really remembered, and one is, the organization does not do what its name says it does. I love that one. It's so smart. So, and the second one was, large functional organizations grow out of small functional organizations. So if you want to build something big, you have to start it small and local and then figure out how to make it scale. And in some sense, that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing in your relationships with other people, and that's what you're doing in your familial situation. That's what you're doing in your intimate relationships. You solve those problems, you develop a template, like a skilled template of perception and action that you can then bring out into the broader world. It's really important. So partly, you know, you inherit a hierarchical structure, and you might think about that as whatever principles bind your culture together, and then some of that's rigid and pathological and half dead and needs to be destroyed and re-updated, and some of it isn't, and you have to figure that out by negotiation, and that's hard. But you don't want to blow the whole damn thing down in one gust like the bad wolf and the straw house. It's like then you have nothing to live in. So you want to make modifications in a culturally determined structure with caution and care, because that is all that stops you, that's all that protects you from chaos, apart from your ability to update your models. And you blow that over and you find out what's behind it. And part of what's behind it is the dragon of chaos and the terrible mother. It's not good. You know, you saw what happened to Iraq when the Americans knocked over the hierarchy, right? It wasn't good. Now, it wasn't good before because it was a tyranny, but it's not obvious that it's better now. You know, and it's also possible that what's going to happen is it's going to be replaced by a way worse tyranny. So, knock over a structure, the water comes flooding in. It's just like a dike or a dam. So, all right, so that's your problem. Now, you know, I set that up as part of a moral hierarchy. So, at the bottom of any process, you say, well, maybe you're trying to be a good person. We might as well assume that. You might say why, but my answer to that would be because it's better than not being a good person. You're going to run into a lot less pain and misery, and you're going to be a lot less destructive, and you're going to hurt a lot fewer people, and you might leave everything better than you found it. And that's not so bad. It's certainly better than doing the reverse of all of those things. So, unless you think there's something particularly positively valuable about pain and misery. And that seems to be, you could make that case, but if I put you in pain and misery, you do everything you could to get out. So even if you thought that that was a reasonable solution, if I imposed it on you, you do everything you possibly could to escape. So all that means is that you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Okay, so because what you act out is more representative of who you are than what you say, because what the hell do you know about yourself? You have a vague model of who you are and a vague model of society. And so you can wrap off some articulated representations, but the probability that they're going to really map the underlying structure is low. So, okay, so we'll assume you're going to be a good person, that's what you're striving for, and then we can decompose that. And you can decompose it all the way down to micro behaviors. And so the issue is you try to build a hierarchy. At the bottom it has all your micro behaviors, you know, the things you can do with your hands and your eyes and your mouth and your body. That's the highest resolution level. And then you're trying to organize those into higher and higher, into more and more abstract and powerful structures in some sense that are also homogeneous inside. They're not full of internal contradictions. So, and that's how you establish peace. That's how you establish psychological stability, and that's how you establish peace. And there has to be negotiations at all of those levels, and roughly speaking, it's better to negotiate at the low levels, if you can do it. You know, so I use this example fairly frequently. It's like, so you've got a 4-year-old kid, and their room is a mess because they've been playing. And you think, well, that room can't be a mess. Why? Well, it's hard to play in a messy room. That might be one answer. So you have to restructure it so that you can play again. That's part of why it should be clean. So then you tell the 4-year-old, clean up this room. And then you leave, and then you come back, and it's like nothing's happened. And the reason for that, in part, perhaps, is because that's the wrong level of resolution to solve the problem at with regards to the 4-year-old. You could only say clean up your room, which would be maybe at the same level as, say, family care there, to someone who has the underlying structures already in place. So you might say to the child, see your shelf. And they can do that because they know how to follow pointing, and they know how to specify an absence, and they know how to link that to language. So they'll do that. See that hole? Yes. Okay, so you know the person has enough skill underneath that abstraction to implement it. Fine. Then you say, see that bear? And you know they can manage that. So they look at the bear. You say, well, pick up the bear. And you know they can do that. So they pick up the bear and you give them a pat. And then you say, put the bear in the space. And they do that and they look at you and you give them a pat. And it's like, and if you do that with a child for the whole room 3 or 4 times, then what you're doing is building the understructures, right, from the bottom up. And then you can say, clean up your room. So, but if the child, so for example, you come back and the room isn't clean, you might think, well, what do you do about a child who's being intransigent and won't clean up their room? And the answer is, well, the first thing you do is make sure that that's the right level of instruction. And that's the case also if you're negotiating with a partner or an intimate partner. The first thing you should assume if they do something stupid, which they certainly will, is that they're stupid. You know, and that you have to help them out building the microstructures of whatever it is that you're asking them to do. Because people are full of gaping holes and they lack social skills of all sorts. It's like, and it's a huge part of the tension between friends and between couples. It's like it's absence of ability. And so you do your person a great favor if you say, you know, you forgot my birthday. Okay, well, what am I supposed to do about that? Well, you might say, well, that's up to you to figure it out. So, no, assume I'm stupid and tell me exactly what you want. And then you'll say, well, that doesn't really mean anything. And I'll say, yeah, but we're going to be like together for 30 years, so if you teach me this one time and it's kind of awkward and stupid, then maybe the next time it'll be 50% better. You know, because you're looking at a trajectory, right? And so you can build, because one of the things you could think about, for example, is, let's say you make a meal. Okay, now let's say your goal is to make a really good meal in an efficient way so that everybody's really happy about it, including you. So that the probability that you'll get to eat lots of really good meals across your whole life goes up. That's a good solution. So then you might think, okay, I made this meal and it was a costly expenditure of time, and I have to be paid for that in some way in order to be happy about it. So let's think about that for a minute, because it's a concrete problem. So let's say you spent a bunch of time making a good meal. Okay, what do you not want people to do? Yeah. Okay, so they're not supposed to say, ooh, what's this? Okay, that's a bad response. What else do you not want them to do? Not enjoy it. Right. Okay, so there's not going to be a lot of bickering at the table, right? Because then you're going to think, what kind of stupid idiot would make a nice meal for this lot of, like, insane chimpanzees, right? So you're not going to want to replicate that. What else would you want them not to do?
Not finish it.
Yep, okay. What else? Not help clean up.
Yeah.
Right, not be grateful. Not notice that you put a lot of time and effort into it. Not notice that it's above the normal standards, that you sort of went above and beyond the call of duty. Right, maybe show a little bit of thankfulness. Yeah? So then you think, okay, well, I want to set up my life so that I get to eat really good meals for the rest of my life and be happy about making them. You think, okay, well, what are the preconditions for that? Well, then you have to fight for the preconditions, because the alternative is you cook slop miserably and you fight, right? And one of the things that's interesting about, one of the things that I often do with my clients is we do some arithmetic, because people have a weird idea about what's important in their life. So you might think, you got 16 hours a day of awake time, right? So, and you're going to spend 4 of those hours, 3 of those hours interacting with food. Okay, so that's, let's say 4, let's say 3. It's 1/5 of your life, 20% of your life. Okay, get it right. Get it right. It's 20% of your life. You got it taken care of. Wow, perfect. You know, and you think, well, who's going to think through those things? It's like, well, do the math. It's not a math, it's arithmetic. It's like, you know, and so sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, I have to fight with my child for an hour a night to get them to go to bed. I think, okay, let's do the arithmetic. So how long have you been fighting with them? 6 months. How long do you think this will continue? Indefinitely, 2 years. Okay, so let's say it's 2 years. Okay, so that's, we're going to say that's 800 days for the sake of simplicity in math. Let's say, yeah, we'll say 800. And so that's 800 hours. And so that's 20 work weeks. So in the next 2 years, you're going to spend 5 months of work weeks fighting with your child. Okay, you expect to like them at the end of that, do you? It's like you're going to fight with someone for like 5 months and you're going to like them. No, that isn't going to happen. So you might think, well, how important is it to solve that problem? Well, it's 5 months of work weeks worth of importance. You could put a week into it and, you know, it might be helpful. And so it's very... I'm trying to make a case that you have to look at the hierarchy, the hierarchical structure of your values, you know, and the best way to do that often is by paying close attention to things that people normally, they're invisible normally. They're invisible. And that's not good. You have to fix them. And if you fix all those things, those little tiny things, if you fix them, which is hard, you know, it takes negotiation, but it's not impossible. You know, because the first thing you want to ask your partner or your family is, well, how would we like to have a meal? You want wretched, nasty food that someone just threw together and it's burnt and we're going to fight about it all the time and it's really erratic and it's not predictable and the person who's making it is unhappy and the kitchen is a disaster afterwards and everybody's angry about that. So that's like one solution. Do you want that? And if they all are sensible enough to say no, then you can say to them, okay, well, what's the alternative? And then you can think, well, we could imagine what the alternative would be, and then we can work on laying out the microprocesses that would lead to that outcome. And we can practice them over time, and we can assume that if we don't get it right in 3 months, that doesn't mean it's hopeless.